American Institute for Cooperation and Agriculture. And today, we will have a very interesting event. Very, very interesting. We will learn today about details of the different tools, methodologies, good practices of a European project entitled BioMonitor. This webinar was established about a month and a half, maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago, and we were participating in the final presentation of the project. We were talking to Justice, the coordinator of this project, and we were talking with Justice in the sense that a good part of this methodology and these tools and results would be very useful for Latin America, because we have many of the challenges that this project aimed at settling. We said at that time that policies, investments, projects to promote bioeconomy need evidence. We need data, we need evidence to guide public policies, for policies to truly have the impact we want them to have. And oftentimes, in our countries, we do not have this type of vision. So we have to develop methodologies, tools to measure bioeconomy, to measure the weight of bioeconomy, the impact of bioeconomy, all the links of the bioeconomy. The resources are extremely scarce, particularly at this time when we are still in part of a pandemic and are at the doors of a recession. So we need to guide our public policies in the best manner possible. And that is what the BioMonitor project aimed at developing tools, technologies to measure bioeconomy, to guide public policies. So today we will hear firsthand about the institutions that participated in the project. They will tell us how they developed the system and what the outcomes were. And at the end, we will have a question and comment session to discuss amongst us all and learn in greater detail about what was done and to discuss the possibility of using these tools in our regional bioeconomy. Thank you once again for being with us. We are broadcasting via YouTube. So on the YouTube channel, you can add your questions, your comments, and we will gather those and we will pass them on to the panelists during that last session. We will begin by learning a bit the evolution of bioeconomy in Europe, then in the United States, and then we will go into the project itself. We will learn about the different methodologies to measure bioeconomy and generate the bioeconomy indicators. And we will end with a presentation by Dr. David Zimmerman on the bioeconomy supply chains. And at the end, we will wrap up with a question and discussion session. So once again, thank you for being with us. Without further ado, I would like to offer the floor to Justice Wessler, professor at the Wageningen University. He is a researcher with outstanding record in bioeconomy. He currently chairs the International Council for Bioeconomy, Applied Bioeconomy, and he is coordinator of this project, a dear friend of mine. So Justice will tell us about the evolution of bioeconomy in Europe. Justice, the floor is yours.
Yes, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Hugo, many thanks for providing me the opportunity to talk about the development of the bioeconomy in the European Union. Now, what I will do in my presentation is talking about how the bioeconomy within the European Union has developed over time. And as Hugo Chavarria already has pointed out, the European Union has a long history on bioeconomy policies and developments. And the bioeconomy in the European Union already started many, many years ago. And as Hugo has already pointed out, we have a project that we coordinate at Wageningen University that is looking into how we can assess the contribution of the bioeconomy towards sustainable development. Now, one of the questions we always face is what actually is the bioeconomy? There are a number of definitions that you can find depending with whom you talk, but at EU level, the definition is something like the conversion of biological resources into useful products. So this includes the production, use, processing, distribution, and consumption of biological resources. And within the European Union, the bioeconomy is seen as a natural enabler that contributes to what we call the European Green Deal transformation. And when we look at the history of the bioeconomy, we observe that a first strategy paper was written in 2012. That was the bioeconomy strategy. There was an updated strategy published in 2018. Then with the new commission under Ms. van der Leyen, the European Green Deal was initiated, where the European bioeconomy is considered to be one of the major contributors for achieving the objectives of the Green Deal. And that was then part of a council conclusion in 2019. And in 2022, a progress report has been published, updating basically on the status of the bioeconomy. Now, as I mentioned, the first strategy paper was published in 2012, but basically the activities already started much earlier. And basically it started already in the year 1996. And there was also a key policy figure behind this, and that is Christian Pettermann. He is in the EU considered as the father of the bioeconomy. He became member of the research directorate for the European Union. He was pushing the development of the bioeconomy. 2 years later, in 1998, we had the first meeting of the International Consortium on Applied Bioeconomy Research, and Hugo Chavaria was already mentioned this. And I'm happy to announce that next year in 2023, our annual meeting will be in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So I invite you all to come and join us, as I'm at this point in time also president of the ICABR. Now, when the EU started with the bioeconomy's research strategy under Pettermann, then in 2006, one of the key papers was published. It's called the Cologne paper on route to the knowledge-based bioeconomy. That sets the stage for substantial research investment in the bioeconomy. And in 2015, then under the German leadership, the International Advisory Council on Global Bioeconomy was established. And in 2020, then another important policy document was released that is related to identifying sustainable contributions of the bioeconomy, which is called the taxonomy regulation. And this plays at European level a very important role for further developing the bioeconomy. And I will come back to this within a few minutes. Now, I mentioned already the Green Deal, and the Green Deal is expected to transform the European Union into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. And there are three major objectives: no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, to decouple economic growth from resource use, and to leave no person and place behind. In total, the investments up to 2030 are expected to be 1 trillion, with 0.6 trillion coming from policymakers and the rest being contributed by the private sector. Now, the bioeconomy strategy objectives include 5 major objectives: to ensure food and nutrition security, to manage natural resources sustainably, reduce dependence on non-renewable, unsustainable resources, to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and to strengthen European competitiveness and to create jobs. Now, having these objectives, it's important to see to what extent the policies at EU level contribute to reaching the objectives. And that is where our project comes into play. We develop methodologies that allow us to assess to what extent the policies that the EU has established are contributing to reaching these objectives. Now, for reaching these objectives, on one hand, we have the EU-wide policy strategies, but member states within the European Union have also developed their own strategies, and that is at certain levels. So some member states have dedicated bioeconomy strategies, and then others have bioeconomy strategies as part of other overall strategies. And here the map shows to what extent dedicated and mixed strategies do exist at EU level. So it's high on the policy agenda of all the member states. Now, when we look at trying to achieve the objectives of the bioeconomy strategy in the European Union, we have to bear in mind that the bioeconomy is a very complex sector. And when we like to measure the contribution of the bioeconomy towards the objectives that I have mentioned, we have to take into consideration that the bioeconomy is basically affecting all different places within our economy. We can say that, for example, many of the activities that contribute to the objective start with research and development on modern biotechnology. And the contribution of modern biotechnology enters the bioeconomy at several stages. So this can contribute to the primary production of food, feed, fiber, and cellulosic crops. It produces information for industry, the processing of enzymes, the development of biofuels and bioplastics, but also in the health sector with new therapies and diagnostics. Now, knowing all this, we have to also bear in mind that these sectors are interlinked with each other. So the health sector, for example, contributes to the primary production sector, for example, animal and plant therapeutics and diagnostics. The primary production sector also provides, for example, biomass feedstock into the industry. The industry produces fine chemicals for the health sector. So we are basically observing a circular economy here, where one sector is contributing to the other sectors and vice versa. And that is very important to take into consideration when we look at how the bioeconomy is developing and what are the contributions. Now, what we did within our BioMonitor project is first identifying sectors using national accounting systems that the majority of scientists working in the area would consider as being 100% bioeconomy sector. This, for example, includes the agriculture, forestry, and fishery sector, but also food, beverages, and tobacco, wood and wood products, paper and paper products, for example. And then we looked into, okay, how are these sectors linked with other sectors that are only partially bioeconomy? For example, in the chemical industry, we know, okay, they use fossil fuel-based inputs, but they also use inputs from the primary sectors. And we try to disentangle this. And then identify to what extent what we call the upstream sector, the inputs that go into the primary sector, for example, and the downstream sector, where those sectors contribute to other sectors, add value to our economy. And what was interesting to observe is that the up and downstream sectors in general provide often more than the main sectors when we look at the value added for the bioeconomy. So these sectors are very important to also consider when we assess the contribution of the bioeconomy, depending on the indicators that we are interested in, for example, value added. It would be a mistake to ignore these sectors. And then we can use these information, for example, to assess the share of the value-added contribution of the bioeconomy to GDP over a number of years. And for this, we, for example, use the OECD input-output tables to derive these numbers. And if you look at our project website, there you will find a link where you can get direct access to these data. This is what we call a dashboard. And there you can then identify in more detail which sector and which member state has what share within the European bioeconomy. Now, what the European Commission did is also looking into all their different policy strategies. And these include, for example, circular economy strategy, industry strategy, biodiversity strategy, farm to fork strategies, and more. And they identify to what extent these different strategies contribute to the different objectives of the bioeconomy strategy of the European Union. And you see in dark green, these are strategies that have a strong contribution, and where you find a white cell, there is the expectation that they would not contribute, and the more you go into the green, the larger the contribution will be. And this is also, again, very important for us for assessing what we can expect from the different strategies, how much they will contribute to the bioeconomy, and to what extent is what the policymakers at EU level expect to be. This is this presentation, and whether or not this is matched by the information that we derive when we look at the data. Now, what makes the assessment of the contribution of the bioeconomy even more complex is that it is not only just looking at the numbers that we find in the gross domestic product in the national accounts, but that the bioeconomy is not only based on these numbers, but they are important policies that have an effect. And this is referring back to the previous slide. And that the development of the bioeconomy also depends on some facts. This is the availability of natural resources for providing the inputs for the bioeconomy. We have the national policies, strategies, and legislations. And we also have to see to what extent they are in line with other strategic societal objectives. And what we did then within our project is to look at the impacts of these different factors, how they contribute to the development of the subsectors such as bioenergy, biomaterials, and food and feed sectors. Now, when looking at the development of the bioeconomy, and in particular taking into consideration policy environment, there's one important issue that needs to be considered. And that is that policies can have a stimulating effect or a destimulating effect. And an important issue is that most of the new technologies that we use for developing the bioeconomy, they require investments in research and development. Most of the products that are an outcome of these research and developments have to go through an approval process. For example, in the European Union, we have novel food regulations for new food products entering the market. We have regulations for new seed technologies entering the market, new plant breeding technologies being introduced. We have regulations that address the application of microbial biotechnologies for fermenters and for biorefineries. Now, the important issue is that the stronger you have the regulation, the more costly it will be for the private sector to invest. And this is indicated here in the left figure. This straight line starting at I1, that is indicating the investment costs the private sector has to do, for example, in R&D. Now, we know that policies often increase the investment costs as companies have to comply with research and development with approval processes. So this is moving down this line from I1 to I2, to the red one. Now, the dismal information that we get out of this is that if you increase the requirements for research and development and for approval costs by $1 extra, the private sector needs for justifying investments more than $1 extra private dollar to compensate for these additional costs, to make this a feasible investment. So the regulatory environment, and that is one of our major results from the project, plays a very important role for stimulating or destimulating the development of the bioeconomy. And here are just some numbers that are related to one of the important strategies, that is the farm to fork strategy. There has been a lot of debate about the contribution of this towards the objectives of the Green Deal. Now, when we look at the results by using models for assessing the contribution, then we observe, first of all, that this farm to fork strategy most likely will increase food prices within the European Union. Right, the consumers are paying. Farmers, depending on which sector they are involved in the bioeconomy, may gain or may to a certain extent lose. But on average, the farming sector will gain. Now, if we look then at the environmental implication and trying to assess what are the contributions for the greenhouse gas emissions, then we not only should look at what is happening in the European Union, we also have to take into consideration what might the spillover effect to other regions of the world, such as Argentina and other parts of Latin America. And if we take this into consideration, these leakage effects, also take into consideration land use and land use change and forestry effects, and further substitution effects, then the results at this point in time indicate that the farm to fork strategy may not result in saving of greenhouse gas emissions. It increases the savings in the European Union, but increases emissions outside of the European Union. This is what our results at this point in time indicate. And this is important to consider if we want to have policies that are in line with the policy objectives. Now, to summarize at this point in time, when we look at the results of the BioMonitor project, we observe that the bioeconomy is extremely complex. We also observe that more than currently needs to be done. So the policymakers have to do more than they are currently do if they want to achieve the objectives of the Green Deal. And in particular, when we look at the taxonomy for sustainable investment, there a rethinking has to be taken into consideration. And now I would like to hand over to my colleagues who will talk on indicators, how to measure them, and the consistency that is needed for deriving those indicators. So many thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward also to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justus. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And I coincide, as we were saying a few weeks ago, on the relevance of this discussion for Latin America. We have several countries from the region that are exactly part of this discussion that you have just covered. We need methodologies, we need indicators to measure not only the weight of bioeconomy, but also the impact that bioeconomy could have on national and regional objectives, and even in the value chain and social objectives, environmental objectives. So this is evidence, this is information not just to think about what bioeconomy can offer us, but also to guide the public and private initiatives, funding initiatives. I believe we need to take advantage of these results and outcomes for Latin America and the Caribbean before going into detail to see the methodologies, the indicators, and the cases of success. In the BioMonitor project, we would like to have a very quick overview. Just as you did for the European Union, we would like to have a quick overview of the evolution of bioeconomy in the United States, because in the last few weeks, we have had very positive news on the evolution of bioeconomy in the United States. But that is why we have Andrea Hudson with us. She is a co-leader of the Bioeconomy program at Smith's Future. Andrea will talk about the evolution of bioeconomy in the United States, because we know that they are also aware of what is happening worldwide. So, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hugo, and thank you, Seth, for inviting me to be part of today's webinar. Hopefully you all can see the screen. Okay, great. And so I was asked to cover the basic developments out of the United States. And so in the United States, we tend to think about our bioeconomy as being composed of three major key elements: biomass, biotechnology, and data, and utilizing the sort of the circular impacts of how biomass feeds into biotechnology activities and biomanufacturing, and how we can use data to sort of optimize and think about the types of products that we can create through biotechnology. As Eustace demonstrated before, for the EU, there is a sort of a timeline here within the United States, and an overall growing recognition of how biological research can contribute to U.S. economic activity, starting also in 2012 with the National Bioeconomy Blueprint produced by my colleague while she was at the Obama White House. And then a series of reports that have happened, that have come out since then, including one that I'll cover today in some detail, Safeguarding the Bioeconomy, that came out in 2020, and a more recent report that we put out on behalf of Smith Futures, looking at the U.S. current bioeconomy, as well as cover some current government activities, as Hugo referred to. But it's worth recognizing in the United States that we define our bioeconomy, so starting with the basic definition, as economic activity related and driven by the biological research and innovation that happens. And so, as I mentioned, I'll cover these two non-governmental reports that have been influential in thinking in how the government has sort of responded in thinking about what are the next sets of actions. And those actions are coming both out of Congress, meaning legislative action, as well as out of the executive branch with presidential action. So starting in 2020, myself and a colleague, Mary Maxon, as well as a larger committee of experts that consisted of academics, economists, innovators, some folks from industry, came together to produce a report out of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which is a private nonprofit that provides advice to the government on all things related to science, technology, medicine, and engineering. And so not unlike how the bioeconomy covers many different sectors, this was a collaboration across many different parts of the national academies, from the Board on Life Sciences to the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources, Science, Technology, Economic Policy, Health Sciences, as well as the cyber resilience, given the importance of data in the bioeconomy. And so just to recap it at a very high level, this group set out to define the US bioeconomy, starting with thinking about the different sectors that impacted or included within the bioeconomy, and broke that up at really high level into agricultural inputs, biomedical inputs, bioindustrial inputs, as well as what we called tools, kits, and services at the time. And that would include everything from the IP lawyers that help us think through how do we protect different innovations and developments, as well as to the different types of kits and tools that you use in the laboratory to enable the different R&D efforts that contribute to the bioeconomy overall. And so this group had a broad mandate, not only to define the bioeconomy, but think about how do we measure the US bioeconomy, as well as think about some of the security implications, which I won't go into today, but happy to talk about later. When we think about measuring the bioeconomy, we face a number of the same challenges that other countries or other efforts have faced in thinking about how do you measure the economic activity related to biotechnology and biological research. And we recognize that the activities span many different sectors and combinations of subsectors of traditional sectors. So it becomes really difficult to measure when you look at traditional national income accounts and how do you pull which pieces of those are related to the life sciences. We recognize that the bioeconomy activity is tied to both science and its commercialization. and it's cross-cutting so that there are common metrics that we use to normally identify, classify, collect, and report economic data don't capture all of the bioeconomy specific activity because it typically gets covered by some other traditional sector. So if you think about some of the innovations in bioeconomy as replacing fossil-based inputs, oftentimes those are going to be captured as the traditional fossil-based inputs rather than this newer type of product or development. And so some of the economic activity from the bioeconomy can actually be attributed to other traditional sectors. And so this group had the recommendation of creating a satellite account. And so this is something that can be done to measure, for instance, the impact of tourism. And you can pull different parts of different traditional sectors into a satellite account so that you can capture some of the activities that don't fit neatly into existing national income accounts. And so that might be an ideal mechanism for enabling measuring of the US bioeconomy. And so what this group did try to do, though, with existing data, which was incomplete at best, and that was one of the major conclusions of this report, is that the existing data collection mechanisms we have are not sufficient. However, using data that was available, and the most recent data at the time this report was being written in 2019, was data from 2016. And so at that time, using that data as an input, there was an estimate that the bioeconomy was worth about, just the US bioeconomy was worth about $1 trillion or contributing about 5% of US GDP. And so again, that was using 2016 data. And so this group had a number of different recommendations. It was a non-governmental group, so it didn't immediately translate into policy, but it did spark a lot of discussions across different federal agencies and different actors, which I'll cover later in terms of the contributions to some of the legislative efforts that we'll discuss in a bit. And so now this past year, my colleagues and I at Schmidt Futures, which is a philanthropic initiative that works to bring together talented people and networks, put together a task force on synthetic biology and the bioeconomy. And so not unlike that first group that produced the safeguarding report, we pulled together a multidisciplinary group of individuals, this time mostly focused on capturing voices from industry. And we did that because we wanted to focus on the transition point between where R&D basic research ends and how we get those products out into the market. And so how do we enable that transition out of the laboratory of these different tools and technologies? And so we ultimately produced a report that came out in April of 2014. I encourage you to look it over. There's 3 parts to this overall report. The first part is a narrative written for general audiences that has a sort of explainer and about the potentials of the US bioeconomy, particularly if you think about moving towards a circular US bioeconomy, which is a newer sort of development in the conversations that this report brought forward, so that we can chart this course towards a resilient and competitive future. The second part of the report, which I'll cover a little bit in detail today, is thinking about the technical strategy. So this is written more for technical audiences about what are the different steps we can take to enable and push the bioeconomy forward within the United States. And then part 3, again, written for general audiences, are illustrative case studies. So how do we conceptualize some of the different concepts within the report and make them a little bit more tangible to folks? So we created a number of different case studies to help translate some of those concepts into layman's terms. And so when we look at the strategy overall, so this is a strategy for enabling a current and future circular bioeconomy within the United States, which is not a commonly held conversation as it is in Europe or in other parts of the world. Circularity is still new in the US sort of policy landscape discussions around the bioeconomy. But this group, and we came up with 5 strategic pillars for action. The first one being expand the research to accelerate the translation of discoveries into public and economic benefit. Again, how do we get this really interesting and amazing basic research out of the laboratory and into the hands of real people? How do we get those products onto the market? And so we need to think about different science R&D efforts related to the science of scale, circular bioeconomy research, and regulatory science, which Eustace also spoke a little bit about the impacts of the regulatory system on the overall bioeconomy. In pillar number 2, We talked about fostering a national ecosystem of innovation and commercialization. This exists for other technology sectors within the United States, but is really underdeveloped when we think about the biotechnology space and the bioeconomy. And so that's everything from creating data and computational infrastructure, different pilot programs that enable the government and venture capital funding to come together and enable progress within this sector, and the ability to connect technology developers with facilities that enable them to scale. And so that brings us to the third pillar, which is the national scale infrastructure for bioproduction scale-up capacity. We have in the United States a wonderful innovator, entrepreneurial startup community, a lot of developers creating a number of really, really interesting products, but they lack access to the facilities that would enable them to make enough of their product to actually get them out onto the market and test them and assess how the market responds to their products. And so there are steps within this part of the strategy to think about how do we create within the United States a network of pilot bioproduction test beds that we can enable US-based biomanufacturing. We can do that through public-private partnerships, through hardware and bioprocess innovation, as well as the digital infrastructure to connect all of these different sectors and facilities. And lastly, if you're going to build infrastructure, you're going to need people to go in and work in those facilities, but also the bioeconomy provides a really interesting opportunity to think about a diversified workforce to power the current and future bioeconomy. And so what we're seeing there is a need to have industry engage more with universities and community colleges to think about what is the curriculum needed, what is the training needed, to enable more workers coming into the US bioeconomy overall. Thinking about cross-disciplinary training programs, this is an incredibly an interdisciplinary sector, as well as thinking about international workforce pathways and awareness campaigns. How do we get people to think about and understand that there are jobs, good paying jobs for them within the US bioeconomy and create a pathway into those positions? And then lastly, really thinking about that policy environment. So how do we enable a policy that incentivizes and supports a circular bioeconomy and try to mitigate some of the negative potential downstream effects? And so the first and foremost, should be no surprise, is we need to enable measurement of the US bioeconomy, very relevant to the conversation we're having today. Enable and enforce different procurement of bio-based products to create a market pull. So it's another way to stimulate the market overall. And as Eustace also mentioned, right, the enabling a well-resourced regulatory ecosystem. The United States has a really robust regulatory process already, but they are under-resourced and therefore needing much more support and able to efficiently move products through the system. Okay, so I will quickly cover some of the more recent actions coming out of Congress and the presidential administration. So starting with Congress, after the Bioeconomy Blueprint in 2012 that came out, there was the introduction of the National Bioeconomy Act into the legislative body. And so what that means is that there was a beginning of a conversation amongst lawmakers about what the bioeconomy could do, but it was never passed. That same bill, through many different years and many different iterations, continued to be developed and changed and modified, and ultimately was reintroduced in 2020 as the National Bioeconomy Research and Development Act with a few different provisions included. And that was ultimately passed this past summer in July of 2022 as part of the CHIPS and Science Act. And so briefly, what this covers is enabling and authorizing the different federal research agencies and science-related agencies with very specific research and development activities, asking them to consider different ethical, legal, environmental, safety, and security provisions so that they could make sure that the development of the bioeconomy happens in ethically and safe, responsible manner. There is language in there about creating a test bed infrastructure. So again, thinking about the infrastructure needed to enable the US bioeconomy. A lot of it is focused also on workforce development. So how do we train that next generation of not only developers, but the technicians needed to operate these facilities? And of course, there was language in there around measurement processes, specifically pulling out this particular part of the text that says, mandating that the agencies devise a robust process for measuring important economic outputs, benefits, and aspects of the bioeconomy. And so there's now the legislative push that says we need to do this. However, that is still sort of in process as it just passed this past summer. Coming out of switching sides from the legislative body to the presidential administration, in 2019, there was a lot of excitement as there was a summit hosted by the Trump administration on the bioeconomy. And it was one of the first major presidential actions since the 2012 blueprint was released. And however, despite all of that activity and excitement, there was a draft executive order that was never made out into the public. And so it was something that was never finalized by this group. However, a number of the folks continue to work on this. The importance of the bioeconomy didn't necessarily lose traction, as the conversation certainly continued with policymakers and the administration, even in the new administration, the Biden administration. And so this past September, an executive order came out that was really focused on advancing biotechnology and biomanufacturing as a way to enable the bioeconomy within the United States. I won't go into the details. It's a very long executive order. There's 12 overall sections, everything from policy to coordination to international engagement. There is a section on measuring the US bioeconomy. And so what's really exciting is that the executive order put deadlines on all of the agencies. And so when we look at what the Department of Commerce, the agency in charge of measuring within the United States, has to do is they have about 90 days to develop a lexicon. How are we going to talk about the US bioeconomy? Because then that will then set the stage for which elements you can then measure. Within 180 days, so starting from September 12th, how to develop a plan to measure the US bioeconomy, and within a year, develop a plan to prepare to update the different NAICS codes that we use to gather the data around the US bioeconomy. All of the different other pieces of the executive order all have a number of different deadlines, forcing the agencies to really take an assessment of what their activities are, submit and create reports that will then provide updates, as well as implementation plans. And then there's embedded in there also progress reports. And so we're really excited. The agencies are very hard at work. Immediately after the executive order came out, we saw a number of different activities across all the different agencies. And so they are very much in the process of gathering information and making a really concerted effort to develop all of the plans within the executive order. And so I think we'll be seeing a lot of really interesting developments as far as the US formally measuring its own bioeconomy in the coming months to year. And so now they're all hard at work. There is some conversations around additional funding to enable all of that work at the agencies. And so that is the part that everybody's focusing on right now in terms of the policy actions, not only getting some of the work done, but how do we make sure that the agencies are well-resourced in order to do that work effectively and comprehensively. And so with that, I will stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. We are also very thrilled because knowing that the US is betting at the maximum level of bioeconomy, and it was quite interesting because we were in conversations with Mary and we did not know that there was this much support for this project and that it would be approved or passed back in July. So Mary gave us the news when we met in Brussels. So Mary's presentation changed radically because they all wanted to know about these news and they were also interested in to know about the next step. So it was really, it was a thrill. So 2022 has been a great year for the US bioeconomy. We've had incredible positive news. And obviously for us in Latin America, that's very, very important because the US for us is like setting trends. So I think that this is a very good message for the Latin American Caribbean countries. Thank you, Andrea, again. So to continue, we'll to learn about the tools, methodologies, and results generated by the BioMonitor project. Justus already gave us some details, but now we're going to continue learning how we measure the weight and linkages of the bioeconomy in the European Union. And for that, we have Vitorija Storm from the Market Analysis Tuning Institute in Germany. And well, the floor is yours. Please let us know what you did and what have been the main results and what were also the limitations. And we're also interested in getting to know what was harder. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Victoria, estás en mute.
You are muted. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Hugo. So now we are back to the European BioMonitor Project. And my name is Victoria Sturm. I'm from Tübingen University in Germany. And now I will have a presentation with the title Measuring Weight and Linkages of the Bioeconomy in the EU. But it has a subtitle. It is Spotlight on the chemicals industry. And at first, I would like to explain why we choose to put a focus on chemical industry. So almost all economic sectors contribute to the bioeconomy, and special weight have sectors generating biomass, such as agriculture, forestry, and fishery. But another group of sectors contribute to the bioeconomy by utilizing the biomass. And here, different types of uses could be defined. For example, use of biomass for food and feed production, use biomass for energy production, and use biomass for material use. Monitoring of sectors producing biomass has a long tradition, as well as the use of biomass for food and feed. Energy use is also quite well monitored, but the monitoring of material use of biomass is lagging behind. And although the data on use, for example, of wood for production of paper is also well reported, much less information is available about the use of biomass for production of chemicals, plastics, textiles, or other materials, as well as the contribution of bio-based production within the respective sectors. And that is where we wanted to take a closer look. Different sectors of economy are interlinked with each other. Interesting is that for the bio-based production, for example, of textiles or plastics, in most cases, not biomass is directly used as input, but bio-based chemicals. So chemical sector is really very interesting in context of bioeconomy, and it deserves to be in spotlight of investigation.
Excuse me, you're muted again.
In BioMonitor Project, we developed a new dedicated tool named Biomat, which aims to provide projections for markets of bio-based materials, and in first step, bio-based chemical, and for respective feedstock needs for EU member states as a whole and individual member states till 2030 and 2050. The focus, as I said, will be on the chemical industry as it defined in the NACE statistical classification. So it aims to cover the whole output of chemical industry and not focus on specific, maybe also very promising products. So we look here on the whole production of chemical industry, take a closer look on the bio-based production. And then we define a scope in which we look on some stylized representation of value chains with grouping the whole output of C20, so of chemical industry, in 16 product application categories, including 2 intermediate categories, which respect products which are used actually only solely within the chemical industry to produce other chemicals. We define different types, 10 types of bio-based feedstock, which use for production of bio-based chemicals, and link the demand for biomass with another modeling tool, which showing the production of or generating of biomass. The next slide. Back. Oh, sorry, I have the problem. Again, this one. So, as I said, we tried to represent the production, the value chains in chemical industry in stylized, simplified form. And here you see how we did it. So we looked into in different kinds of raw biomass. Here only some products are presented. Then we look into intermediate products, some intermediate chemicals, and move to the end to the semi-final products of the chemical industry. Here we see them. Now we can fill this chart with numbers, and it was very difficult undertaking because in official statistic, you cannot find these numbers. So we applied different procedures to generate respective database and make this chart full with figures. After that, we could construct such kind of Sankey diagram. It represents the database in a very concentrated way. So on the left side, you see the quantities of different bio-based feedstock used by chemical industry for production of different chemicals. You see, for example, the plant oil are a very important feedstock for chemical industry, as well as starch. On the right side, you see the different types of chemical products grouped in different application categories, and see the quantities of output. According to the NACE statistic, production of biofuels is also part of the chemical industry. And as we see, it has a very heavy weight. Among 40% of bio-based products produced within chemical industry are biofuels. Besides output, bio-based output, you see also this yellow loop. It shows which bio-based chemicals are used actually by chemical industry itself. So it's representation, actually, material flow of biomass and bio-based chemical for European Union in 2018. We also looked how the bio-based chemical industry developed in the last years, but also we make projections for the future. And here on this slide, we see, for example, the production of bio-based chemical in European Union. So currently we have approximately 45 million tons are produced in the EU. In the same time, we see the quantity of domestically used bio-based chemical products, and we see that European Union currently is in net importer of bio-based chemicals. Using the statistical information of volumes of bio-based products and values of bio-based products, we calculated also unit price for bio-based chemicals. And you see the development over time. But which weight bio-based chemical industry have in the total output of chemical industry? One of the indicators for this is share of bio-based production in total output of chemical industry. We look specifically in organic chemical industry, and we have estimated that currently approximately 15% of the total output of organic chemistry is bio-based. The rest is fossil-based. Our tool also allow us to look how projections for different application categories. And now we see how much more will be produced in 2030 in comparison to the average 2016-18. So, and we see different development across different application categories. We see that still the production of platform chemicals and biofuels are the most important categories, but for example, surfactants is also getting more and more important. The blue dots show how the development, the percentage rate, growth rates over different application categories in production. Another possibility to present our results is to look how bio-based chemistry developed over different countries in the EU. So here you see different European countries, and again, the orange bars show how much additional bio-based chemical products will be produced in 2030, and the green till 2050. The blue dots also show that the development, the percentage growth over different member states is not always the same. So some countries
Sí, démosle, sí, se ve la imagen congelada. Démosle unos segundos a Victorilla, a ver si
We're going to
logra.
wait for a few seconds to see if Victoria can connect again, because we lost the signal.
Bueno, creo que lastimosamente.
Well, I think that unfortunately, Victoria's connection was lost. So we will continue.
Con las demás. Ahí está Victorilla de nuevo.
Oh, we have her back.
Sorry, I didn't get where you got when you lost me. Is it already for a while?
No, te perdí. Se te perdió la conexión hace 30
Well,
segundos.
we lost your connection like 1 minute ago.
Puedes continuar.
So maybe you can continue.
Sorry for this. So when we are looking into the chemical industry, it's the same story as with other industries using biomass. If the biomass will be used, is it sustainable? Is it have positive or negative impacts? And in this case, it is very important to look what kind of biomass is used and where it's come from. So, for example, for chemical industry in the European Union, we have estimated the quantities of feedstock used for production of chemicals. We have differentiated between feedstock used for production of biofuels and feedstock used for production of non-biofuels, so other chemicals. And you can see that most of feedstock is really used for production of biofuels. And as we have already in Europe this discussion that maybe the increase in biofuels production in Europe could lead to deforestation, for example, in Latin America, this issue is really very important, and where European colleagues and policymakers are always looking into it. So you see over the time, the quantity of biomass needed for production of chemicals increase. But biofuels in our projections still play a dominant role. So, but in most cases, we are really interested in the biomass used for production of non-biofuels, so for chemicals that are not used as fuels. And with this slide, I want to show you how is the composition of biomass used for production of non-biofuels. You can see that actually the starch, the industrial plant oils, but also lignocellulose from wood and use would be very important in the future. But also, for example, the use of animal fat. In this specific slide is also, we cannot see where the biomass is coming from, because actually if you have a market for plant oil in Europe, you can never say plant oil you are using for production of biochemicals, is it imported or is it produced domestically? But in case, for example, of palm oil, it is quite clear it's not produced in the EU. And especially for such kind of oils that are not produced in the EU, this sustainability issue is very important. So with this slide, I stop my presentation. I hope you see most of my presentation, and if you have any question, please, I will answer them.
Gracias, Victoria. Excelente.
Thank you, Victoria. Excellent. Very, very interesting. There are several questions in already via YouTube. I will not elaborate on those now, but for the time being, we are undertaking a similar process in South America, so we do have several questions for you, but we will discuss that at the last session. Now with us, we have Maximilian Carbon from the University of Washington. He is a professor in research, and Maximilian will tell us about the EU bioeconomy indicators that were part of the project. Go ahead, Maximilian.
Okay, so I just had to unmute myself. Yeah, thank you very much. I really like this opportunity to present our research also to an audience outside of the EU. That's a great opportunity. And in my presentation, I'll talk about the dynamics of bioeconomy indicators for the European Union. And let me start with a short introduction of the bioeconomy, but it's already covered basically. Also, Andrea already talked about the circular bioeconomy, which is also becoming the main idea in the European Union. And that means that you have to apply the principles of the circular economy within the bioeconomy. So maintaining the value of products, materials, and resources for as long as possible, and minimizing waste generation. So measuring the progress of the circular bioeconomy is important for managing the development and also ensuring that the development is sustainable. And it requires quantifying a range of indicators that measure the progress, but also the impact on the economy, the environment, and society. There's already a lot of indicators out there in the literature and in other projects. For example, Dia et al. In 2018 proposed 161 indicators, and we in the BioMonitor project in the beginning also looked in the literature, what is out there, what can we use for our framework, and we in the end had a list of 84 indicators. But it is difficult for policymakers to track all of these different indicators. So what I'm presenting here is a research that is not focused on quantifying or developing single indicators, but instead it's a framework that allows policymakers to have different different views on a lot of indicators in the framework. So the objectives of this framework is to find patterns in the evolution of the circular economy in the European Union. And we developed a framework that can work with any number of indicators, so also a very large number. Actually, the larger the number, the better for this framework. And then we use Markov transition matrices to have a very unique look at the dynamics of indicators. And this allows us to have basically 3 different views on a large number of indicators that tracks the development. And we compare this evolution then between different EU member states. So it's France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Slovakia, and Latvia. So we try to cover a certain geographical distribution within the EU. So we also have different types of bioeconomies and to compare them. And we look at the time between 2006 and 2016, which is due to the data availability. So always data is a big problem if you want to measure the bioeconomy. So we take data as we need already a longer time period available. We took data from Eurostat's indicator set to measure the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we also included indicators on the circular economy. And we restricted these indicators to those that are related to the bioeconomy. So they contribute to the bioeconomy objectives of the EU strategy, or which are circular economy indicators. We also needed to check that indicators are consistent in the interpretation, meaning that some indicators, as you can see in this table, you want to have them as high as possible. Some indicators you want to have them as low as possible, as for example, ammonia emissions. And also for some indicators, you have the case that you actually want to have them in balance. So they should be 0, as for example, the nutrients balance on agricultural land. And then a short overview of the framework that we developed. It has 4 steps, and it's based on the z-scores in the beginning. So you have all these different indicators that have different dimensions, different units. So it's very hard to compare them like this. So we use the z-scores to remove all units and magnitudes. So they have then a value of about -2 to 2, which reflects the development over the time period. The next step, we also want to make the indicators comparable in a way that we can rank them on this basically the speed that they have in the development, and also if they're going down or if they're going up over time. And the third step, we use Markov transition matrices to analyze it into a distribution dynamics of the indicators. I won't explain too much about this because that would take too much time, but you can also read it back in the paper if you're interested really in how this methodology works. And lastly, we also have in the 4th step specific mobility metrics who measure this interdistribution that in the previous step we calculate. So we have then only we have 2 measures that compare the extent of indicator movement over the whole period. So coming to our results, this is basically the first view that we can, with our framework, offer on the bioeconomy, and that is taking into account all the indicators at once. Due to the z-scores, they all have the same, they all have no unit, and you can see here that they all go basically from -2 to 2. And on the left, on the y-axis, you have the different years. On the top is the first year, and then the bottom is the last year. So you can see that the distribution of the whole indicators is shifting from the left to the right, meaning that it's increasing. But you can also see that it's not really a normal distribution, but there's quite a variation in the indicator values over the years. And also in 2016, where the median is, for example, the highest, you can have still values below 0. You can also see this in these box plots that that also look at the development of all the indicators over time. Here you can see that the median from 2006 to 2016 is consistently increasing, while the interquartile range, so the variability of the indicators, is in the beginning and in the end higher, and in the middle it's a bit less. So next we have also this opportunity with our framework to look at the single indicators and look basically on the top of the indicators and at the bottom. So having the best indicators who performed the best over the time period and the worst indicators. Here I give 2 examples. We have done that for all the countries in the study. So first example is Germany. You can see that the share of renewable energy is increasing a lot over the period, which can also comes back from a lot of investment into renewable energy during that time in Germany. At the same time, you can see that among the worst indicators are the ammonia emissions. So that goes to show that some very important indicators for the environment were getting pretty bad over this period. Below you can see it looks similar for Finland. Also the share of renewable energy has increased, but here we have, for example, the circular material use rate, which was decreasing over the time, as well as some indicators related to research and development. So some more examples, I can go quickly through them. We have also Slovakia, where greenhouse gas emissions have progressed, so they have decreased, but the gross nutrient balance on agricultural land has actually worsened over the time period. And also for Latvia, we can see that ammonia emissions have worsened over the time period. So these were the first 2 views we can offer, and now also very interesting one is that we looked at this intra-distribution dynamics, and what it looks at is how the different indicators are developing relative to each other. And here we can see an example of one of these matrices. And if you look at the diagonal row, you can see this would give us a percentage chance that an indicator from one year of another is staying in the same group of indicators. And so in the top row, we have Germany, where these values are relatively low. This indicates that the indicators are relative to each other moving a lot. And while in bottom we have Portugal, here are the values higher. That means a lot of the indicators are staying in the same among the same indicators. So there's not so much movement, meaning the indicators are developing at a similar pace. And then lastly, I have these mobility metrics, which basically gives the same information as these matrices, but nicely summarized in one value. So here you can see that again, Germany has one of the highest values for the first mobility metric. And at the same time, you can also see the change in mobility, which for most countries became less in the second period compared to the first period. Only in Poland, Slovakia, and Italy, it was actually increasing or staying the same. So one more thing is we also compared for the different countries how the average mobility is related to the z-scores over time, which you can see on the y-axis. So the y-axis gives us the development of all the indicators over time, and the higher the country, that means the more the indicators progressed. And the x-axis shows us the mobility. So you can see a general tendency is that countries who have a higher mobility, so are more on the right of the axis of the graph, also higher. That means that also their indicators are progressing more than in other countries. But there's also some exceptions. For example, Finland has a relatively high mobility, but very low, or even the lowest development of these scores over time. Coming to a bit of discussing these results. So we looked at the evolution of the EU 10 circular bioeconomies which showed us that generally they are progressing. If you take this broad view at all indicators, but if you look more narrowly on also the individual indicators, you can see that there's also for a country like Germany, which overall has the best development, they still have some important indicators who were worsening of the time period. And looking at the mobility, we can see which measures the indicator movement between segments. We can see in the higher in the long term, this mobility is higher, which of course makes a lot of sense because in a short period there will be more. In a short period, indicators will not move around as much as in a long period. And also, if you look only at short-term mobility, this is higher in the second half than in the first half. So our recommendation to policymakers, which might quite sound quite simple, but very important, that you have to consider all the indicators and not just a few that maybe you consider the most important ones. And I think we also, in our framework, we acknowledge that you need a lot of indicators to measure the development. But then again, this makes it difficult to count or to take them all into account in your decision making. But we still think it's very important, and our framework is offering one option to take into account a lot of indicators. So yeah, in Slovakia, Poland, and Latvia, the development was very quick compared to the rest of the EU. Which is kind of a surprise. It's because normally other countries are before them, but it's important that in our framework we only look at the progress over time, so we do not take into account the initial level at which countries are. So it might be that Slovakia, Poland, and Latvia only are catching up to the rest, and therefore they can also have a more improvement. And yeah, some countries improved pretty slowly, even though they have dedicated bioeconomy strategies. It shows that these strategies, not just having them, is also not enough to have a good result. And of course, data availability was a big problem also for this research. Could not assess its initial state because indicators do not have specific targets for each of them. And in the future, we might also, if we get more indicators, group them according to different sustainability dimensions, for example. And of course, we would also like to add more countries to the analysis. So maybe in this occasion, if someone from South America, Latin America has a lot of data available for us and would like to collaborate, we would be happy to also apply this framework to other countries. And that's my presentation. Thank you a lot.
Gracias, Maximilian.
Thank you very much, Maximilian. I would like to come to this last phrase you mentioned, where you said you have a methodology that has been built and that has been analyzed in detail. There are many EU partners behind all this effort, and you have already applied this methodology in many, many countries. You started with a large number of indicators, more than 100, and based on those, you went reducing them, shrinking them, identifying which were most worthwhile. And that is what we in Latin America have been trying to do. And that is where I believe there are many possibilities to work together. So this was a very interesting discussion. We have several questions already from YouTube. We have a lot of people connected, let me tell you. I am sure that people are very grateful for these presentations. So we will have a very good discussion at the end. Now we will move to a presentation on cases of bioeconomy in Europe. Jean Maria from the Catholic University of Sacred Cœur in Italy would tell us about the cases they selected, the results of all of this. Just a brief comment on this, on these cases. In Latin America, we have insisted that in order for us as a region, as Latin America and the Caribbean, to really tap the huge potential we have in bioeconomy, Latin America has half of the biodiversity that is known. We have many technological possibilities. We have agriculture that is a star here. But in order to take advantage of all these potentials, we have to create more awareness. We have to convince. And the cases of success, these cases, like the ones we will hear from Jean Maria, is one of the best ways to convince decision makers and convince private sector and academia. So this is of a particular interest for us. So Jean Maria, go ahead, please.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today in order to present how the BioMonitor monitoring framework can be applied to assess the overall sustainability also of specific bio-based productions, take into account also upstream and downstream effects. In this particular case, we applied the monitoring framework to the organic fertilizers production from sewage sludge. So just a little bit of introduction to understand why we applied the monitoring framework for this specific production. Well, as Professor Justus Wasseler mentioned, the European Commission is committed to develop a more resilient and sustainable agri-food systems with important and ambitious package of policy initiative like the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork. And here, basically, the agri-food system play a key role for food security, but also for other important intermediate key targets like the reduction of GHG emissions, increase of renewable energy, and reduction of pesticides and fertilizers use. Now, unfortunately, supply chain shocks like the dramatic climate event and now also the current conflict of Russia and Ukraine makes even more complicated to reach these targets and these goals. And this is particularly evident, for instance, in the fertilizers market, where we can see basically in the past 2 years that the prices basically skyrocketed. And this is due to the increase of the natural gas, which is one of the most important operating inputs for the production of nitrogen fertilizers. It's related to the increase of food commodity prices that increase the use of fertilizers. It's related then also to some geopolitical issues and export restrictions, like during COVID, China stopped to export the fertilizers to satisfy the domestic demand. And now also with the Russia, due to the sanctions, for instance, in Italy, in Europe in general, there is an effect in the exports. And Europe is dependent on Russia fertilizers for 45% of the total import. So it's a little bit a problem here. And it's even more complicated for fertilizers due to the rigidity of the demand for this kind of input, because we don't have actually a lot of substitutes for that. And most of all, they are essential for our productions. One potential solution is the production of organic fertilizers from sewage sludge, which is a bio-based product from urban and industrial wastewater treatment plants, meaning that because of the population growth, urbanization planning, and industrial development is a type of feedstock and waste that is just increasing in terms of quantity. So it's becoming even more a problem to deal with all this quantity. And the literature shows that if properly treated in the long run and the long term, the application of these organic fertilizers can increase the nutrients in the soil and satisfy the part of the demand of our crops. So we were very interested to apply the BioMonitor monitoring framework for this type of production. Now, the model that we applied to assess the overall sustainability of this production is an hybrid input-output approach, multi-regional input-output approach. I'm not getting into the details of the model itself, but I want to highlight an important feature and property of this model. So in any impact assessment, one important aspect is the definition of the system boundary, which activities to introduce in your analysis to assess the performance, the sustainability, circularity, environmental, economic, social impacts of your production. And most of the time, this definition of system boundary is left to the judgment of the practitioner, a researcher, that most of the time is also very limited in terms of resources. So it doesn't include all activities into the analysis. Well, with this approach and the combination of process detailed based data with a multi-regional input-output database, basically we can capture the global effects, including also the upstream and downstream effects that you can have due to the demand of this new bio-based production in other supply chains in other countries. So where we get data, basically the multi-regional input-output database that we use is called Exiobase, which represents the monetary flows of 200 products and 163 industries within 49 regions in the world, taking into account also the imports and the export among these industries. It also offers a huge set of indicators, environmental, social, and economics in terms of resource use and also emissions. And basically, the methodology that we applied introduced into this framework a new sector, a new bio-based sectors, which data were collected by a large-scale company in Italy that process along the year 160,000 tons of sewage sludge to recycle in agricultural production with the production of the same amount of organic fertilizers. And basically they use this amount of organic fertilizers in 10,000 hectares destinated to rice and corn. Basically, after the collection of this data and the application of the model, we can provide this type of information to policymakers, to decision makers in the assessment of the bio-based production. So in this particular case, we applied the model for 4 different indicators, an economic one representing the economic stimulus generated by the bio-based production, a social indicator represented how many jobs are created due to the demand of this type of production, and 2 environmental indicators, one related to the GHG emissions, one instead the energy consumption. Now, if we look, for instance, the social indicators, here we can basically see that for 10,000 tons of sewage sludge recycled with this technology in order to produce organic fertilizers, locally on site, there is the need of 5 people working in the plant to recycle and process the waste into a new value-added product. But if we take into account all the upstream effects associated with the increase of the demand of inputs needed in this production, in this bio-based production, we can see that the overall effect is in reality 21 job creations. Meaning that most of the impact, the social impact in this case, associated with the bio-based production is mainly indirect and assessing only the on-site, only the local effect of the bio-based production, we can underestimate of more than the 75% the overall impact of the production. This is the case for also energy consumption. As you can see here, the energy consumption on site is only the 3% of the overall energy consumption generated by the production. So with this type of analysis, we also can show the vulnerability of the bio-based production, where we have to take very careful attention when dealing with the bio-based production. In this particular case, for instance, 98% of the energy comes from renewable energy, so there is no consequences in terms of environmental implications. We can also move forward and assess where the implications, the impacts, the indirect impacts are allocated. So in this particular case, for the social implication, we can see that there are 5 jobs created by the bio-based production. 20 are the total, considering also the indirect effect, and most of this direct effect is related with research and development. As mentioned by the professors Justus Wasseler, the bio-based company in this particular case has to invest a lot on research and development for the progress of the technology in order to maintain the competition with more established alternatives, conventional alternatives that can better capitalize on economies of scale. In this particular case study, the main competitor is land filling, for instance. So we applied the same type of analysis for land filling, and we assess basically the differences between the 2 types of waste management strategies. And we can see that, for instance, in the social indicator, if we take into account only the direct effects associated with the production, there is actually a loss in job positions, meaning that the land filling needs more labor than the nutrient recovery strategy in loco. But if we take into account also the indirect effects upstream and downstream, we can see that the nutrient recovery strategy overall creates more jobs than the land filling. So again, how important is the indirect effects for bio-based production? Now, as a final point, an important aspect that we need to provide to policymakers or other decision makers in the provision of these results is also the uncertainty surrounding the estimations, because there is a lot of uncertainty always related in impact assessment. So instead of providing just a single value, basically with this methodology and applying a Monte Carlo simulation, we can also assess what is the distribution of potential values for each indicators. So in the particular case, for instance, of GHG emissions, we can see a distribution for the nutrient recovery strategy GHG emissions, and a distribution for the GHG emissions of land filling. we can first see that the uncertainty surrounding the emissions generated by the bio-based production is less uncertain comparing to the emissions generated by landfilling. And the second aspect that we can see is that even considering this uncertainty, the overlaps between the two distributions is very low, meaning that even considering the uncertainty surrounding our results, the probability that the emissions generated by the bio-based production are higher than the landfilling strategy is very low. In this particular case, it's lower than 0.05% of probability. But this is not always the case. This is, for instance, the employment indicator, and we can see that the overlaps between the two distributions, it's higher. And in this particular case, for instance, we can provide the information to the policymaker that, yes, taking into account the indirect effects associated with employment in the nutrient recovery strategy, there is a greater employment and social impact compared to landfilling. However, there is a 37% of probability that this is not the case. This is not true. And so that's, in conclusion, what I wanted to say, and that's a demonstration of how the BioMonitor monitoring framework can be applied for specific bio-based production. In this particular case, we can see the trade-off between the nutrient recovery strategy and landfilling for different indicators, highlighted and the importance of the indirect sustainability performances for bio-based productions. And definitely the importance to assess the uncertainty, that even if it's related and high for a single indicator, the overlaps between the uncertainty among different technologies can be low, and still then the results can have a very significant value. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you, Gian Maria. We're definitely going to have a great discussion at the end. We have received very good questions, and we have people that is very interested, not only on results, but also on the methodological aspects. And as I was saying, there are different efforts to work on this. So thank you again, Gian Maria. And to close as the cherry on top of the pie, we have the great honor of having David Silverman with us, a professor at Berkeley University since 1979. If my data is correct, a recognized, well-known economist and an expert on bioeconomy and agricultural systems. And he's going to share with us a presentation on the bioeconomy supply chains. So the floor is yours. We see your presentation. Please go ahead.
David, estás en mute. Tienes que activar el micrófono.
David, you're muted. You need to activate your microphone, please.
Okay, can you hear me? Perfect.
Sí, perfecto.
Okay, it's a big honor to be here. I'll speak a little bit about a supply chain and then a bioeconomy of supply chain. Generally, economics was formed when agriculture was a dominant industry, and it's based on emphasizing the role of market and competition. But the reality is that agriculture is changing, the economy is changing. We have much less equilibrium, a lot of innovation, a lot of supply chain, and now instead of only thinking in terms of market, we should really think in terms of how market interacts with the supply chain. And the two main features, in my view, of the modern economy are innovation, high rate of innovation, and that innovation lead to new supply chain. Now I separate between two types of supply chain for innovation and supply chain for product. And both type of supply chain are crucial by the bioeconomy because the bioeconomy need a lot of innovation, and this innovation is the resultant product. Now, so generally speaking, whenever you design a supply chain, you have to design about what are the elements of the supply chain and what will be the structure, what will be the size, would it be a vertical integration, contracting, what type of market you will have, and that's one thing that I like to emphasize. Now, generally speaking, you start with research, research lead to knowledge, knowledge lead to innovation, and it may result in either it can go through university or it can go to some product design companies. It leads to some sort of product development, commercialization and supply chain, product introduction, modification, and decline. So we have to recognize that the bioeconomy is the cycle of life, where all the time we need to have new innovation that result in a new supply chain, that result in new products, and that have to be replaced. So to some extent, there is this element of circularity that is essential in the bioeconomy.
David,
Yes. Yes.
David, perdón.
David, sorry to interrupt. The people from the audio and the interpreters started letting us know that your sound is so low. So can you please speak louder, please?
Now it's okay. Can you hear me?
Or closer to the microphone?
Can you hear me now?
Yo te escucho bien. Me parece que el problema era en el canal en inglés, pero si puedes hablar un poquito más alto, mucho mejor.
It would be even better if you could speak louder.
Okay. So oh, I'm really sorry about it. Anyhow, so to some extent, there are several mechanisms of innovation. One mechanism is educational industrial complex, where academia come with new innovation and the private sector implements it. For example, in the United States, we have this a big emphasis on offices of technology transfer, where you have a situation where a university comes with innovation, it moves to startups, it moves to commercialization companies, and a lot of researchers become innovators. An alternative approach is that you have companies that design new products that basically use existing ideas and put them together. I say these two ways of doing things are extremely important in the bioeconomy. The next thing that is very important is that the important to start to think in terms of innovation, in terms of dynamic, and understand how it designs supply chain and what will be the restriction on supply chain. Now, generally speaking, we have I like to speak about multi-state supply chain, but the simplest is a two-state supply chain when you have some sort of a feedstock like corn or sugarcane and you produce biofuel. And this type of supply chain can describe the biofuel, can describe the flour in Kenya, describe supermarket. And the key element that whoever has the supply chain has to decide about how to maximize the profit, taking into account processing costs, production in-house, expenditure to suppliers, and a lot of time supply chain are monopolistic or monopolistic. You cannot expect them always to be run by competitive economies, and it's important to reduce processing costs, innovation costs, integration costs, and this is mean that you really need to have supply chain that will not be burdened by regulation. The other thing is that things are changing all the time, and credit is very important. You need to provide credit because when you design a supply chain, and this is really crucial by the economy, you won't develop a new product if you don't believe that there will be a buyer for this new product. And I think this is one of the key elements you need to develop demand for new products in bioeconomy. If you want to have for example, alternative source of fertilizers that are healthy, you need to develop some sort of demand, and sometimes by government policy, by education, or by reducing regulation. The other thing is that markets are endogenous. The supply chain and innovation create new markets. And in many cases, I expect to see less and less market and more contract and vertical integration and a lot of arrangements that are non-market arrangements because we need to have product differentiation. And to me, building a new bioeconomy means building more differentiated products. And this is especially important for Latin America, where you need to develop new type of products that have some regional specialty and regional power rather than commodities. You make much less money on commodities and differentiated products. And I think that's another element. So as I said before, you can have several types of institutions. You can have vertical integration plantation, contract farming. You can have a situation that you have what's called nucleus plasma, and you can have reliance on market, but it's all changing. Now, if you can really find is that, that we really need to worry about credit regulation and trade opening, and we have to think in terms of dynamic. Now, let's look and see what does it mean about bioeconomy. The bioeconomy is utilizing resources and biological knowledge to produce food, fuel, product, and other things. Now, the key element in the bioeconomy is recognizing that we move away from producing commodities in the biosystem to processing and producing not a major product. The other thing is that agriculture is much more than food. And therefore, we need to develop many feedstock and to rely on a lot of new technologies. Another thing is important of circularity. You need to develop supply chains that are multi-product. For example, biofuel in the US wouldn't be viable if we didn't have distilled dried grain that goes directly with ethanol and provide income. In Brazil, bagasse has to go with sugarcane. Now, the other thing is that
David,
yes.
David, disculpa, perdón.
David, we apologize for interrupting again, but the IT people are telling us that we can hardly hear you.
Okay,
I don't know if you could speak directly to the computer or speak closer to the microphone because we can barely hear you speaking.
Okay. I know what I do. Okay, great.
Or maybe on Zoom, on the lower left corner, there is an arrow where you can indicate the microphone that you can use. So maybe you can use a different option to see if the volume improves and we can hear you better.
Can you hear me better now?
Mm-mm.
This is crazy.
No, me dicen que no.
Can you hear me now? Not at all? Oh, I'm really sorry.
Mel,
Man, okay. Anyhow, so can you hear me now, guys?
¿Me confirman en el canal inglés si se escucha mejor?
Can you hear me?
Si desconectas los audífonos, tal vez se escucha mejor.
maybe if you remove your headset, maybe? Or if, I don't know.
Now, can you hear me better?
No.
Yeah, yes? Can you hear me better now? Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know what to do. Oh, man.
Ok, no, dice, avancemos así, no hay problema. Vamos, si, tal vez si te acercas bastante al...
Well, let's keep on advancing, but please let's speak up and closer to the microphone, and our apologies.
Can you hear me now?
Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to finish it as I'm really.
Gracias, David. Gracias. Más bien, disculpa.
Okay. 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 It's okay now. Okay. So as I said before, supply chain are essential for the bioeconomy, and I give some examples. And the bioeconomy, to me, is crucial for addressing climate change. Agriculture is more than, let's see. Agriculture is more than food, and there are new traits that are improving, that are improving photosynthesis, that allow you to fixate nitrogen, to fight diseases. So to me, the bioeconomy is crucial to climate change, and you cannot have, that's the key point, you cannot have the bioeconomy without modern biotechnology. To me, the vision of the bioeconomy and supply chain is that you need to introduce as many products, a bioeconomy product to increase yield, reduce the acreage of agriculture, reduce the productivity of agriculture, and use land and natural resources to produce alternative products, and to provide sequestration of carbon. Another thing that is very important, that solar energy will require a lot of land. So you need to produce solar supply chain that integrate solar energy and agricultural production. Another thing that is really important is to produce a protein. And you need to produce protein in order to produce, for example, aquaculture, because today aquaculture is relying on feed meal, and we won't have it in the future. So to some extent, we need to develop several very important new supply chains that wouldn't be competitive necessarily, that will be global, that will be integrated, that will produce a new product that will integrate solar energy with agriculture, produce a new protein, and produce food and fuel. And therefore, it's really crucial that the regulation will be such that almost all of the technologies that we can have will be used. The barrier for GMO and CRISPR are disaster. They affect the food, and they prevent the ability to develop new technologies that sequester carbon. The bioeconomy without the biotechnology is a car without the engine. The other thing that is very important is being a stronger biogas sector. When you have animal agriculture to produce biogas, what would have happened in Europe if they have more biogas? They would be less dependent on in Russia. So in each of these cases, we need new supply chain. We need to design new supply chain for biogas. We need to design new supply chain for solar agriculture. So to some extent, this is incredible new line of research that we need to develop. So to some extent, government really need to some extent, to tax certain activities that generate greenhouse gases, and to some extent to provide the initial incentive to establish new supply chain for new industry, because no one will enter new industry without some sort of support. Tesla was able to grow without getting some money from California. So to some extent, you need to have financial incentives that allow to develop new product and new supply chain. Another thing is credit. You need to have a combination of mechanisms for credit, government to subsidize research, venture capital to subsidize startup, and banks need to be able to get support from government to develop new supply chain, and consumers need to be aware about types of new products. Another element is the capacity to adapt. The supply chain, existing supply chain, would recognize that there is a change and move from one place from one element to another. The supply chain of almost all products has to move from non-renewable to renewable. And we have this modeling, but we need to develop research how to do it. And it's especially important in Latin America. So altogether, what do I mean? That education industrial complex is a new element of innovation. We need to have more privatized innovation. We need to have more researchers invest in innovation. We need to develop supply chain for the bioeconomy because agriculture is more than food. We need to allow biotechnology to reach its product, and the government needs to develop financial mechanisms that would allow new supply chain and new products to get involved. In terms of economic, we need to study supply chain. We need how to design supply chain. We need to integrate credit, finance, and economics to develop a set of new products. And I really think that that Latin America is ready and will be a dominant feature in the global bioeconomy if they will emphasize more innovation, if they will emphasize more creative supply chain, and if they continue to develop the scientific infrastructure and take advantage of a new bioeconomy. I believe that the bioeconomy and the ability to produce a renewable product and sequester carbon will be the key to save the world from the climate change. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, David. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, David. Well, we have a lot of interest. And David, if you agree, you can stop sharing. So now we are going to open this space for an exchange of ideas. We have interest in the discussion. So we have over 15 questions that we received through WhatsApp and YouTube. So I have tried to group these questions on the different topics and by people. So we're going to have a space for dialogue. I'm going to start with some questions and reflections. And afterwards, we have Eduardo Trigo, who will continue with a couple of additional questions. So questions for Justus. Justus, I grouped 3 questions. There is a great difference between Latin America and Europe when it comes to bioeconomy, because Europe indeed has a regional initiative. They have the European Union. So they are betting on the bioeconomy, and based on this regional strategy, they have built upon the national strategies and then territorial strategies. We don't have that a regional umbrella or institutionality in Latin America. So the first question is, what is the role that this regional organism has played in the promotion of national bioeconomies? That is my first question. And the second question is, you have worked in the generation of methodologies, tools, and indicators in order to measure bioeconomy, and also to generate information regarding the weight of bioeconomy and the linkages with the rest of sectors. So how can we transfer all this information, data, and statistics, and how can we turn this into evidence for decision-making purposes? And how can we transfer this to the policymakers, to the investors, and how can we turn this information into a knowledge that is going to have an impact on public policy? Justus, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Hugo, and the audience for putting very challenging questions here in front of me. Now, the bioeconomy strategies, they help to organize policies. They are not solving the issue of developing a bioeconomy, getting a bioeconomy kick-started. That will depend on all the other actors. That includes the private, in particular, the private sector. Now, the policy strategies can help to improve and support what the private sector will do anyhow. Now, that was very important for Europe when they started with the knowledge-based bioeconomy, basically to set the incentives, the policy incentives, to further go ahead in that direction. That policymakers, that among policymakers and other actors in the society, awareness about the bioeconomy had been raised. And the same you can do for Latin America. AICA can be one of this important agents there to create the awareness and to put the attention of policymakers to the importance of the bioeconomy. And that will then, in the end, also further support, hopefully, the incentives of the private sector to further invest in the bioeconomy. So that is basically where policymakers can play a very important role. They cannot solve the technological issues, etc., but they can support the development of the private sector by supporting policies. Now, when it comes to the indicators, etc., so first of all, I invite all of you to look at our website, where we have the publications related to the development of the methodologies. They are independent of whether we are in Europe or in Latin America or in the United States. Right. There you also will find what are basically the information that are needed. Many of the calculations that we have done are derived from national accounting statistics. And you have them under the UN system. And the OECD, for example, is providing updates on input-output tables. And from those, we have derived many of the methodologies that we are using. And if there is further interest, we are happy to help organizing courses or similar activities to train people on, okay, how do you apply the methodologies that we have developed here in BioMonitor? Now, to what extent are they of policy relevance? Yeah, that is for us always a challenge, right? For scientists in general, to what extent will policymakers listen to us? Now, we have the advantage in Europe, the bioeconomy plays a very important role. Our project was basically really initiated due to the need for having this information for the policymakers. So there was a generic interest by the policymakers in the results of the project. Now, to what extent they will then later use those results that we have generated for further policymaking is a little bit difficult to say. We hope, of course, that they will use our information for, let's say, example, the circular bioeconomy joint undertaking, which is a public-private sector initiative at EU level. And at this point in time, we observe that they are using our results for designing the policies, and in particular, the policies that are related to what we call the taxonomy, for identifying what kind of investments, what kind of production methods can be considered as being sustainable. And there, our results, the models that we have developed, are an important input for assessing the sustainability. We are not always happy with how they use our results. That is sometimes where we as a researcher face also some challenges, right? That our results, so in quotation mark, might be a little bit misused. So there we have to be very careful, but they are used.
Gracias, Justus. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Justus. Thank you very much. A third question for you and for Andrea also. And after this, I want to make a comment. There's a question regarding what do you expect is the track record, the future of bioeconomy? Do you foresee there will be a convergence in the trajectory between the United States and Europe, for example, in the area of regulations, technologies, markets? Do you think there will be that these trajectories in the bioeconomy and between Europe and the United States will merge at some time? We will start with Justice and then Andrea, and then I have some other comments.
Yes. So I expect that over time the policies will merge or move in the same direction. And that is basically due to the fact that the natural science, the technological science do not differ between the United States and Europe or Latin America. So these basic facts, they apply everywhere. That also implies that some of the technologies will work better from a technological perspective than others. And that will also then imply that the regions will move in the same direction. Now, there will, of course, also be somewhat we will observe somewhat of a differences in speed, etc. And that is due to the policies that are supporting the technology. Now, because we have this strong support in Europe and in the United States, I also expect that at international, there I'm hoping, also more harmonization activities will take part. And that is related, for example, to identify what in international trade will be considered as being supportive for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for example, that the methodologies to be applied will be harmonized so that they will not be used as a tool as for trade as a barrier to trade tool. And the other thing is then related to technologies, and David has spoken about CRISPR-Cas technologies, but there are also other new plant breeding technologies that are very important for getting the bioeconomy running. And we know that these technologies are differently regulated. Latin America, in particular Argentina, is really very much moving ahead with what many people consider as being a very pragmatic and a useful approach for regulation, while Europe has been criticized for their current level of regulation. The US is somewhere in between, but that over time we observe a harmonization, and this will also stimulate the use of these technologies. But that is a little bit of speculation from my side. But I like to see what Andrea has to say.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I largely agree. I think, especially looking at the executive order that came out of the Biden administration in September, there's a direct call to look internationally and to collaborate internationally and think about where the regulatory systems and the different enabling incentives should be coming together. And I think just last week, we saw the US finally make a decision, the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, make a decision on cell cultured meats, which is following in the example or in the steps that Singapore has already run. So I think the US is looking internationally and looking to see where the different convergence of the policies are going to take, but also because, as David was alluding to, right, so much of the supply chains and the markets are interchangeable and interdependent. And so I think because of that, we're likely to see a continued sort of forward motion in the same general direction. And hopefully that is done collaboratively.
Thank you, Andrea. The second question that arrived for you was precisely related to that. They want to know a bit about what the United States is working on in bioeconomy and how you are going about it, particularly because of that reason, because as you were just telling us, and you had told us before, the challenge at this time is to reach agreement and get a bunch of institutions together to work together that are related to bioeconomy. Some of those institutions are in science, and others in technology, others in pharmaceuticals, others in medicine, and all different institutions, all different industries. So how to bring all of them together to work on a national bioeconomy strategy?
This is a great question for the United States. So the United States is a very decentralized system in terms of all of the different pieces of the federal government that have to come together really for the first time to focus on enabling a bioeconomy in a coordinated way. And so that's why we were really excited to see that in the CHIPS and Science Act, that piece of that really specifically with the bioeconomy, does call for a national coordinative initiative. And so to see that put into law and say agencies, you have to do this, you have to all work together is a huge first step. The United States has not had that type of centralized push before. And so we'll see what comes out of it, right? It's in just early stages. The law just passed in July. The White House executive order came out in September. So what we are seeing right now is the agencies at the individual level still gathering information about what they already have internally, putting that information, making it much more publicly available, but also engaging with the developer community. So there's listening sessions convened by different parts of the administration, as well as the different agencies, to hear from academics, to hear from industry, and to hear from different parts of the sort of the policymaker think tank community as well. And so what we're seeing right now is just information gathering to figure out how the US is going to move forward in a coordinated way. And hopefully once that happens, it'll be easier then to think about what's going to happen internationally. So there'll be a central point of contact, hopefully within the United States. There'll be an entity that is responsible for oversight of the US bioeconomy, which has been lacking. And I think that's part of the lack of sort of progress we've had at the policy level. For driving the US bioeconomy, even though the industry has been moving forward and developing very quickly, it hasn't sort of gone in a unified direction. So hopefully with these set of policies, we'll enable that type of coordination, but it's still very early. So at the moment, information gathering is what's happening, and there's a lot of demand for input. And so we've been sort of encouraging all of the different developers to talk to both the federal government as well as consumers to drive demand and inform what policies would be useful moving forward.
Thank you, Andrea. In Latin America, we are very interested in understanding this progress. So we hope that in the forthcoming months, we can have webinars to hear about the progress made in those tasks and the outcomes. And why not the possibility for collaboration we could have with other countries? Thank you. 2 questions for Victoria. Victoria, when you were talking about some of the challenges you have faced, and we have also faced up to a certain point, is what do you consider are the variables that you see to define whether a product is bioeconomy or not, or is bio-based? That is the first, based on the definitions. What do you analyze to determine whether something is bio-based? The second question, what is the role of bioplastics in the biochemical sector and the chemical sector? And a third question, for all the analysis you carried out, how do you consider the contribution of biomass that comes from outside the EU, particularly from Latin America and the Caribbean?
Thank you for great questions. So regarding the first question, which is maybe the most easier one, what is defined as a bio-based product? So we're looking at the feedstock is used for production of specific chemicals. And actually, this information is very important to construct the database. And it's if you have a bio-based product, so product that have at least a bit biomass as a feedstock in itself, it is already defined as bio-based. And then you see, you have to look into it. For example, you have on the level of Prodcom code in the statistic, you see, okay, this is a quantity of production of total output from this activity. And then, you know, for example, specific quantity is produced using biomass. But even one product could be still only partly produced of biomass. So you really need a lot of information on it, and it is not available in the statistic. One of the activities in the BioMonitor products was to initiate the separation, to make additional information available whether these products are produced on biomass or not, and to in the future to have this differentiation in the statistics. Currently, it is not available, and for our database we constructed within the BioMonitor project, we have partner within the project that are really gathering this information in the EU. So they have collecting information on the level of firms. They are conducting interviews or gathering information in another way, and collecting the information how much they produce, and then using additional knowledge about the production routes, they can estimate also, for example, which share of input in this product is also bio-based. So it is very difficult to collect this information without statistical information available. On another, in another case, for example, you have in statistic, for example, glues that are produced from starch. You know that it is products that are really produced only for biomass, and they are 100% bio-based, for example, and they are reported. They have its own protocol code, so this kind of information is then very valuable. But you don't have it for all products, so you need additional information have to be collected, and it is in many cases expert knowledge. And this methodology we have developed, it's really very helpful in a short term. It could be used in a medium term, but on a long term, the strategy is to have the separation on the protocol level between bio-based product and fossil-based product, for example. So it was the first question, and regarding the role of bioplastic. I have shown there such kind of Sankey diagram where I have shown, for example, in the EU, the quantity of bio-based feedstock that is used for production of chemicals, and there the output. And it's really that chemical industry, it's produced biopolymers that are used in a sector for production, in the sector of plastics and rubber. In the statistics, it's named this way. They use it as an input for production of bioplastics. So with respect for polymers for production of bioplastic as output of chemical industry, it's not very important. But when we're looking in the total bioplastic, it's still very difficult. You have also to take a look in the recycling, which quantity is recycled, and then which quantity of plastic used virgin feedstock, and then to look where is it bio-based or fossil-based. But currently, I think it's really, there are only some estimates, and it's the share of bioplastic in total plastic is still very low in the EU. And regarding biomass, so yes, it is sometimes, as I mentioned, quite straightforward. If you are talking about palm oil used for production of biochemicals, it's quite clear it's not produced in the EU because you don't produce it there. But in the case you use another feedstock, for example, you use starch, and you can say, okay, European Union is self-sufficient in production of starch. So you produce enough quantity to cover all uses. But still, there could be some trade with starch or starch derivative sweeteners products. And at the end, you have on the market quantity of starch is available, and it's not really possible to trace whether, for example, starch from wheat you use, whether it produced in the EU or out of the EU. It's not enough information on this level available. But we can say that in most cases, bio-based feedstock used by chemical industry, that for most of this feedstock, Europe is self-sufficient currently. So theoretically, with exception of plant oils, it can cover the whole demand, including material use.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria. We have a question for Jean Maria. Because of time reason, we have 11 more minutes to end this session. I would like to ask to respond very concretely. The question for Jean Maria from Jorge Quillares from the University of Bonn. He says, when you estimate the impact of bioeconomy and generating employment, could you disaggregate these estimates by type of job? In other words, the academic training that this type of job would require. Jean Maria.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question that gives me the opportunity to clarify some part of the method. So yes, we can get into that details. We apply a production layer decomposition analysis, and we can assess where the jobs are located. So like research development, or its manufacturing industry, or other services. Furthermore, we can also understand at which level of the supply chain those positions are created. Are created in direct suppliers because we purchase those inputs, or because the direct supplier is purchasing other inputs for the supply of the bio-based inputs. So at which level of production layer the impact is allocated. Yes.
Gracias, Jean Maria. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Jean Maria. Thank you very much. Two questions for Maximilian. How, from our national accounts, can we measure the impact of bioeconomy on the environment? Environmental matters, resilience, climate change, contribution to decarbonization, etc. That is the first question. And the second, according to the studies you have undertaken, what have been the most effective policy measures to foster bioeconomy practices?
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting questions. I think the first question, the framework I presented is not maybe the right one to address this question, but more what we have done also in the BioMonitor project using the input-output tables, which can also be extended to include also environmental effects. And yeah, maybe Justus could also say something more about that. And about the second question, we also have not looked, I think, now quantitatively at which measures are the best to promote the bioeconomy. I think having a strategy already is a good start, as Justus already said, to align different policies. But it's, as I also said, not enough. Just having a strategy is not going to do a lot. You need to involve the private sector and also maybe steer the development in the direction that you want, for example, towards more circular approaches. I think one measure that seems a very good working measure for me is actually from the US, and that is this basically bio-based procurement program. I don't know, Andrea, if you have looked at the impact of that program, but for me it seems a very good way to really get the market started, so to have the government buy these bio-based products specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Maximilian. Yes, you're absolutely right. We have examined literature, and this is one of the problems that has been assessed more most to foster bioeconomy. One last question, and I open this up. I don't know if just us, David, would like to refer to this, but the question is that, well, in the bioeconomy report of the EU, they say that there will be ever greater pressure, and the demand will say that bioeconomy be produced in a sustainable manner. Are European laws and US laws, are they going in that same direction to produce sustainable biomass? Or are there still gaps that we need to try to close? This is an open question. David, Justus, anyone?
In my view, the key question is developing policies that will address some of the basic challenges that we have. And I think that there is still a big difference between the EU and the US, especially when it comes to biotechnology, the emphasis, for example, on organic farming. To me, organic farming is something that in the long run will not be sustainable. And the other thing is that there are several regulations that are essential if we want to have a bioeconomy. For example, we need to develop mechanisms to measure the greenhouse gas emission of different technologies in order to allow sequestration of carbon by trees, by soil, and by algae. So to some extent, there is a huge research and measurement needed, and a coordination that is needed in order to have a global system of a bioeconomy. Now, I worry that a lot of the policies that we have today that's supposed to be sustainable are not sustainable. The emphasis on organic is one example, and the fact that Mexico now doesn't allow export of corn GMO is another. So I really worry that sometimes the road to hell is full of good intention. So I think the key element is to develop science-based policies, and that the scientific community will work together to develop mechanisms that would allow us to allow renewable practices, for example, soil sequestration of carbon or production of alternative products to be done in a way that will be reliable and appropriate. So we need to coordinate not only bioeconomy policy, but big global effort in research and regulation that would allow us to take advantage of the human potential that we have. Thanks.
Gracias, David. Muchas gracias. Justus,
Thank you, David, very much. Justus.
Yes, let me add to this. First, to what Max said, or the question related to environmental issues. So there are satellite accounts that are currently under development. There are some that are existing, and they can be used to assess the environmental impacts. And as David has already mentioned, the important issue is that we agree on the methodologies there. How do we do these calculations? And what we observe from the BioMonitor project is that at this point in time, the data that we have available are still at too high level of aggregation. That does not allow us to say precisely enough whether or not a specific activity is related to increase or decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. And there more needs to be done to get better information together. Now, there is also the hope that harmonization will happen. So we have been contacted also by the standardization agencies in the United States to say, okay, how did you do this for Europe? And I think that is exactly the way how we have to work, right? So if someone is moving a little bit ahead, okay, let's work together and see how they have done. And for example, in the BioMonitor project, we are training for the regulators that are assessing the import of products, how you measure carbon dioxide in products, right? The technologies exist, but you just have to know how to do it. right? And you have to train the people on this. Then when it comes to bio-based products, exactly that is where you can use these methods to identify how much is bio-based and how much is fossil fuel-based. And then, well, countries have different regulations. Like in the in Europe, we have products that are then labeled, right? 30% bio-based, 50%, 80%, 100%. Well, if the United States want to follow something like that, that's up to them. But we have to agree on the measurement, and then the related policies may differ, and we have to provide for this flexibility.
Gracias, Justus. Sí, efectivamente.
Thank you, Justus. Yes, absolutely right. That was the objective of this opportunity, to make available all those efforts that you are undertaking or you have already undertaken, and share that with countries in Latin America where we are working on exactly the same thing. Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Mexico today are working on how to measure bioeconomy, in some cases in greater macroeconomic aggregates and biosatellites, but in others at a more sectoral level or at a micro level. So all this information for our region is of great use. That was exactly the objective, but thank you very much. Well, we have shared all the questions. There had been many. We tried to shrink them and merge them. And I thank you all for having responded. I would like to offer the floor to Eduardo Trigo for some final comments. And I would like to thank you very much for your availability. Many people connected through YouTube, and many of you want to go to be in contact with the different speakers. I'm sure that we will get in touch with you later. Eduardo, go.
Well, thank you very much, Hugo, and thank you very much to all of you guys for very, very nice and profound presentations. I had made a couple of notes about questions what I put on the table, but they have already been answered in a way. One was about the biotech issue and how you saw the sort of the existing differences between or at least the seemingly existing difference between Europe's strategy and the American strategy. The Americans sort of putting biotechnology high and center of the strategy, and the European Union not so much, which has been sort of historical that differences. And if you saw any changes on that, and I think that that's been commented by Justus, and I think that I agree with his vision, and I say that probably we should the present crisis coming out of the situation in Ukraine probably will have something to do with the positioning of the different on issues such as these. And the other one was about policy effectiveness, and I think that Jean-Marie commented on that, and I think that I'm not going to go on that, and I'm not going to extend very much, but we have gone over time anyhow. What I would like to emphasize is that I think that the bioeconomy is centering. I think that this discussion we have had today, it's a very, very, very important one, because I think that the bioeconomy is entering a different stage now, at least from the point of view of Latin America, because until now the bioeconomy has been an idea. I think that the last couple of years, including the pandemics and the situation in Ukraine, etc., has put in sort of the bioeconomy more on limelight as one of the possible pathways out of the present situation, an area of opportunity if we are going to solve some of the problems that we need to confront at this time. But still, the bioeconomy is not a big issue in the international market, and it won't be until we reach some agreements on the norms and regulations and standards for foreign trade, for foreign trade to be possible for foreign trade to evolve. I mean, it's not going to evolve until the products of the bioeconomy doesn't come into the international code system, so that trade can be conducted at the micro level. I mean, that is a very significant, and I think that in that sense, I would highlight, and I think that that's an issue, Hugo, we have to come back with Justus and the people in the States to see if there is something that we can do there, because I think that coming to an agreement in those issues on how do you define bio-based and how you incorporate those segments into the standards and norms of international commerce, it's going to be an issue of huge importance for the region. As a last comment, we have had some experience in trying to build up a satellite account for Argentina, just for the sake of it. I will I will share in the presentation, I would say, the cover of the study and some of the results we have had. And the biggest problem that we had in putting together the satellite account in the country was the fact that it's not in the national, like many sectors, many things that are going on are not in the national accounts and in the input-output tables. So we had to go, as you mentioned that you had to do, into alternative methodologies. Some of them quite, I would say, quite sketchy in terms of relying on expert opinion and that kind of thing. It's very important for us to know that you have had the same problems, and I would also emphasize, Hugo, the importance that maybe we try to sit down and share the methodologies and try to come up with similar with a sort of internationally agree or more broadly agree methodology. I know that the U.S. also worked with a national account methodology to estimate the estimates that were presented today. So I think that there is a big opportunity there, and I thank you everybody for fantastic for a very, very good presentations, and for I think that this has been time very well spent. Thank you very much, Hugo.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Eduardo.
Thank you, Eduardo. And I would like to thank all the panel members. It's been a great pleasure to share with you and learn from your experiences and work. And as Eduardo said, I think that this is the beginning, and I would hope to have much more spaces in order to be able to learn and discuss what we have already talked about with David, Justus, and evidently with Eduardo, because we have the possibility of working together on measurements and metrics. And I don't know if the term would be standardization, but we should come to an agreement regarding what we'll analyze and measure and identify the potentialities and linkages on bioeconomy. And to do that, evidently, there is a lot to learn from what the US and the European Union have established so far, and we'll see each other in Buenos Aires during the international conference of ICABRN. And By the way, I wanted to tell you that we're going to have the International Conference of Consortium of Research on Applied Bioeconomy from the 4th to the 7th of July 2023 in Buenos Aires. So you are, of course, invited to present and submit your proposals for papers, presentations, abstracts, and anything, because we still have this opening, the receipt of proposal till November 30, and we're going to have this great space to be able to learn and share. And next year in Canada, in late October, we're going to have a summit, and hopefully Latin America is going to have a very, very important participation, and we are getting ready and preparing ourselves. So we're going to have many different spaces to keep on learning, building, and exchanging. So again, thank you very much. I would like to thank you all for today's participation. And we hope that this is the first of many spaces that we'll be able to share together. Thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you, Hugo. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye. Bye to everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.